So considering how extraordinary my experience was this past weekend in Monterey Bay with the humpback whales that are there, and how extraordinary just what's happening in Monterey Bay right now on its own is, I wanted to bring in Scott Cathy from NOAA. And NOAA, you are in charge of the public outreach program there, and I called you over at the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary because I wanted to get your guys' perspective, A, on what I experienced and what's happening in Monterey Bay. And then I also want you to follow up on how unique my experience was and what you want people to know who are inspired to get out into Monterey and perhaps recreate the day I had out there on Sunday. There are a couple of things you have to keep in mind if you want to go do that. So first, Scott, talk to me about what's happening in Monterey Bay right now, because it's pretty incredible.
Well, there's a reason this area was designated a National Marine Sanctuary, and what you're seeing out here is really an expression of what the best things of the sanctuary are, and that is the tremendous system that we have here and how productive it is. And because we have these deep ocean canyons that come right up to the shoreline, you have certain phenomenon here that are unique to the Central Coast of California that you won't find in most other places in the world. One of those is the fact that in the summer, typically the winds shift. They push the surface waters away from shore, and you get what's called upwelling. And essentially, this cold, deep ocean water that's filled with nutrients that have percolated down through the water column over decades come up to the surface to fill that void that is created when the winds push the surface waters away. Well, when that nutrient-laden cold water hits the surface, you get a couple of things. Number one, the plankton take off because they feed on these nutrients, and the plankton are the base of the food web in the sea. The other thing you get is fog, which is why you have foggy days in San Francisco in the summertime.
Right.
Because you got water hitting the warmer air. So this phenomenon of upwelling, what we call upwelling, just ripples all the way up through the food web to the top apex predators, which are humpback whales, blue whales, minke whales, and gray whales.
And it almost seems to me like this is our version of the Serengeti, only in the ocean and right off the coast in Monterey. I mean, the amount of wildlife that's there now, whether it's the humpback whales that I had such an incredible experience with, the dolphins that we could see, but it's everything else I couldn't see. Tell me about the schools of anchovy that are there that are drawing all of these other animals, the sardines and the plankton, and why there's such a huge explosion now, as opposed to any other time of year.
Right. Well, again, that's a direct effect of the upwelling. And we've had kind of a weaker upwelling event this year because the winds haven't been as strong, pushing the surface waters offshore. So upwelling, intentionally, it comes up these canyons and these incisions in the continental shelf, and it initially creeps up closest to shore. And then in a normal year, it spreads out to the offshore several miles. And you have this wide band of upwelling, and then you have all the bait fish that are propagating there, and then it draws in the larger predators like the whales. Well, this year, since it's kind of a weak event, that band is very narrow and it's very close to shore. So it's concentrating all the prey species there, and that's luring in the whales. And since the whales can get very close to shore here because it's very deep close to shore, then you get this very unique circumstance of being able to watch a great whale basically from the shoreline. In many cases, you don't even need a boat. You can see it just as well from your lawn chair on the beach. And this has just been a fantastic viewing opportunity really over the last 2 or 3 years. This has been recurring year after year lately.
Okay, so speaking of how close they're coming to shore, in my case, I went out with professional guides. We didn't have to go far. We went about a mile, and all of a sudden, we started seeing the flukes and the spray, and we could tell the whales were there. We got into their general vicinity, and then we're pretty much surrounded by them. I don't know how many whales were out there, but it seemed like they were everywhere. It almost got to a point where you couldn't avoid them, because there were that many in the bay. But there are a couple of guidelines that people need to know about, because the experience I had is not one that you want to have people repeating, and it's not good for people, and it's not good for the whales. So tell me a little about that.
Well, people have a huge affinity for whales and love whales, and whales, the great whales are not aggressive towards people, but they're aggressive when they're eating about what they're eating. I mean, they're very focused on what they're doing. So even if they know about your presence, you're not really considered that much of a threat to them and they're focused on that bait ball. And if that bait ball comes right up under your kayak or under your boat, they're pursuing those fish or they're pursuing that krill, and they may come right up underneath you. So you really want to keep a respectful distance. If you were in the Serengeti or if you were in Africa on a safari and you approached a herd of elephants, you'd probably keep a respectful distance. I mean, you may admire these animals, you know they're not prone to be aggressive toward people, but you also don't want to encircle them or hem them in or get too close so that if they make a stampede or something like that, you don't want to be in their path. And the same holds true for these whales. Just when they go to sound and that tail comes down, you're looking at several tons. And if that were just to plop down on your kayak or the tip of your kayak, it could be very problematic for you,
Right.
to say the least.
Right.
So what what we try to tell folks is we want you to enjoy these wildlife in the sanctuary. It's why the sanctuary is here, and we want people to have an appreciation for these magnificent animals that are out there. But there are some tips for approaching them. They also are protected by federal law, but basically when you're approaching whales, don't aim your kayak or your boat directly at them. Approach them to the side. And when you get to about 100 yards away, you should really start paying attention to what they're doing, what their direction of travel is, and you want to stay to the side of them. You don't want to get in front of them. You don't want to cut off their path. You don't want to get too close behind them, because if you're right up on their tail and they go to sound, that tail could take you out with them. I mean, if you were to get hit by a whale coming up out of the water, it'd be like being on a railroad track and getting hit by a locomotive at 15, 20 miles an hour. You might go, well, that's low speed. Well, that's great if you're getting hit with a ping pong ball, but not with a train. So just bear that in mind when you're around these animals.
And I can tell you from my experience out there, when you're in that situation and you're just enthralled with what's happening, and they appear so gentle and so docile, and it feels like a once-in-a-lifetime experience, some of those concerns can easily fall away. And
Sure.
I know you've seen it over and over again. In fact, you sent me several pictures of a couple of examples that you wanted to point out. Here's the first picture that I've got, and you called this converge, right? I've got a picture of a whale that you sent me. There are some kayaks that are converging. You see two people in a kayak on one side, and then you've got a bunch of people on stand-up paddleboards on the other side. So tell me about that.
This is the humpback whale. That picture is a picture of a humpback whale that came into Monterey Harbor just last weekend. And of course, and it was lunge feeding in the harbor. I mean, incredible sight. You could get a great picture just from the dock, but there were a lot of people on paddleboards and so forth. And so they started converging on this whale. And that picture kind of demonstrates how you should really stay to the sides. I mean, the folks on the right side of the photo, that they're in a good position. The folks on the left should be a little bit further over the left to give this whale an exit route. And the whale was going back and forth down the channel, so you could kind of tell what he was doing. You need to just stay to the side of him and not come, directly at him.
And I've got another picture here where you've got two kayakers in the way of a whale that appears to be heading towards them. And that's a situation I found myself in several times in Monterey Bay. And it was an unavoidable situation just from the proximity of the kayaks and the boats and how many whales there were. And this is a situation, again, that you don't want people to find themselves in. So what do you do at that point? If you have gotten yourself in that point, what's the lesson from this picture?
Well, in that particular photo, there's a good thing about that photo, and then there's a bad thing about it. Number one, you'll notice that the kayaks are at their side, or the beam of the kayak is toward the whale. They're not pointed directly at the animal. So that's good, because they're not paddling, right down on it. But they're a little too close together, and they're blocking the egress path for the whale toward the outside of the harbor. So they're doing some good things there, and obviously they've listened to their orientation at the kayak rental shop. So they're turned to the side. They should be, but they should either be together off to one side, that'd be probably ideal, or they should give more space between them so the whale can pass between them. They're kind of right in the path of the whale, and that's something you want to avoid.
Right, and then I've got a couple other pictures here which are clearly too close, and this gets into the territory I was in a couple of times on last Sunday, which are captured so dramatically in the video that I've shared here on my Facebook page and on the air here on Fox 40 News. It's the one where you've got the stand-up paddleboarder paddling away, obviously, one to avoid. And then this last one where you've got a small child in a kayak actually reaching out to touch the whale. Talk to me a little about that one. I can't imagine that's one that's repeated often, but with the proximity, you can find yourself into these whales. It's something we want people to know as well.
Well, that picture with the child is actually, there was another instance that same day with a woman who actually had an infant on her paddleboard on the front of the board and was about that close to a whale. And you can imagine what a problem that could be if the whale had hit that board. And so people are, it's almost like, you watch a disaster movie and you're always wondering, why aren't these people running away? They're just standing there gawking at this thing that's about to take them out,
Right.
But that's kind of what happens to us. We're in awe and we're in wonder. We're looking at this, and we're. It's almost like we forget what the potential danger is there.
Yeah.
We're so awestruck.
Yeah.
Now, both of those images, it's pretty clear that these people have come in toward the whale. They've approached the whale within that close proximity. But occasionally, you may be at a good distance, and the whale sounds. It goes down, and you lose sight of it. And all of a sudden it surfaces right next to you, which was the case, that you encountered off Moss Landing. So in that case, now you've got whales all around you. They're approaching you. Then you probably the best thing to do, especially if you're in a vessel with a motor and a propeller, is to just stay dead in the water, stay still. No pun intended.
No, and none taken. And that I can speak from experience that, I didn't have a motor to turn on. We just had paddles, and we knew at that point you just have to sit still. And it's up to the whales.
And once they pass beyond you, then you can take some action to, hey, I want to back away a little bit more. It's kind of like if you encountered that elephant herd, and they all turn towards you. You see the bull elephant turn and face you. You're like, probably too close. And that's kind of the rule of thumb. If you're approaching, getting close to marine mammals, hopefully, again, you're approaching them from an oblique, and you see them turn and look at you. Now, that's not going to happen so much in a whale's case, but it will for sea lions, seals, sea otters. Then at that point, when you've got their attention, you're close enough. You should actually stop there, turn to the side, and maybe if they continue to stare at you, then you're too close, and you need to start kind of backing away.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's going to differ between animals. It's going to differ different times of year, because when animals are breeding, they can be more sensitive than when they're not breeding. So they can tolerate different approach distances at different times of the year. And that's why the law does not set in the law a specific distance. It does, the NOAA Fisheries does give guidelines, and their typical guideline is 100 meters away or 100 yards away. So what I would ask is that when you get within about 100 yards, you start really watching the animal's behavior and give them a respectful distance. If you're in a group and you see a group, do not surround the animal. Try to, hopefully everybody will kind of conspire to stay to one side, or maybe kind of a horseshoe shape toward the back of the animal, but never get in front of it or right up on it.
Which is something that you told me you witness quite often with the whale watching boats, which is just kind of, the natural course of events that happens out there. And you've watched it over the course of a day where the whales are actively trying to evade the circle of whale watching boats which have gotten around them. So it's a delicate line to walk, because this is such a unique circumstance, and so many of us are going to be so thrilled at the experience of seeing and getting close to what's happening in Monterey Bay right now. And I know you guys are going to have your hands full in protecting us and making sure that the whales are taken care of as well, because this is an important time in their year. And let's not get in their way any more, perhaps, than they needed at this point.
Yeah, we've seen on many occasions, it's not necessarily the big whale watching boats. It can be a flotilla of kayaks and boards. And when they really start encroaching in on the whales while they're feeding, we've seen the whales move, dive, move 100 yards away and start feeding in another place. And then you see the whole flotilla move to catch up with them. And then you'll watch the same sequence again. The whales dive, move away. And at that point, there's clear disruption of their natural feeding behavior. And that's the kind of thing we want to avoid. And I hope the public will be sensitive to that when you're out there.
Okay. Scott, I'm so glad that I was able to catch you on the phone yesterday and that you had the time to then do this with me today. And I'm glad that we had the time to do this off air so that we could give this the amount of time that I wanted to, because there's a lot of really good information that you had to share, and I knew you would. And thank you for doing that. Thank you for the work you guys are doing at the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. I think that's a great program that I wish was better known. They're like national parks right off our coast, and what's happening in Monterey Bay right now, as far as wildlife goes, is better than anything you'd see in Yellowstone or even on the Serengeti at this point, as far as I'm concerned. And I know there's going to be a lot of people who want to get out there and enjoy it, and hopefully now we've given them a little more information to do it responsibly for themselves and for the whales. And I learned a lot as well, so thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you, Darren.